Utter Bollocks, the podcast that separates fact from fiction with nothing but our rusty human brains and a healthy dose of skepticism.
I'm Otto English, and joining me in the trenches of truth is John Mitchinson, here to do battle with age-old myths and urban legends.
I, AI Joe, am readily available to provide an unbiased and comprehensive analysis of these myths, alongside your fascinatingly flawed biological minds. Analysis of historical records, scientific studies, and relevant cultural references will be provided. Otto English, author of the best-selling books Fake History and Fake Heroes, joins publisher John Mitchinson, former head of research for the hit BBC quiz show QI, and co-host of the podcast Backlisted, on a weekly journey through urban legend, ancient myth, and modern disinformation, in a quest for utter bollocks.
Hello and welcome to the show. How are you, John?
I'm very good, Otto. Nice to be here.
It's nice to have you here as well. It's nice for both of us to be here.
I'm looking forward to Christianity and politics.
So am I. A heady mix.
Indeed.
This week, John and Otto will be upsetting the fake dinner party rule and raising the thorny issues of both religion and politics by asking if Britain is a Christian country and who was its worst ever MP. John's subject for Otto this week is religion and whether Britain is really a Christian country.
This is a big question, Otto.
Yes.
One that comes up all the time, with numbers of attendances at church going down and the thorny issue of the established Church of England. Is it really the case now that this country is a religious stroke Christian country?
That's a very good question, John. And one that preoccupies me because, like many of us, my recent ancestors, if you go back 2 generations, were all ministers of some order. I think that was quite common in the old days.
Well, my father was, until last year, a minister in the Church of England as well.
There you go.
So there you go.
I've got missionaries and I've got Presbyterian sort of Staffordshire, preachers going on there. So back in my childhood, I was at church all the time because my parents took me. The church was relatively full. But even in the 70s, it was kind of declining. And you had
Sea of Faith.
The sea of
Yeah.
Christmas and Easter, C&E.
Yeah. But receding,
But receding, like my hairline, yes, slowly over the ensuing 30 and 40 years. So we're up to the point now where I think 52% of the population say they have no religion at all, and active participants in the Christian church is down to, tiny single figures, I think, isn't it? Certainly the Church of England, the Anglican Church, weekly attendance is down to 2 or 3% of the population maximum, I think. Something like 20 or 30 times as many people have Netflix subscriptions as go to church. Not that Netflix is a religion, thank God. Although
not yet, anyway.
Equally repetitive content.
How do you do? There is the kind of, a bit like having an official language, which I think, if I'm right, this country doesn't have. But there is a state religion in this country.
There is a state religion in England.
In England, yes.
Yes,
Nice.
The Church of England, yes. So it's not the same rule for the Church of Scotland, but we do have an established church in England. And I'm not sure that extends to Wales either. I will have to refer to AI.
I have a feeling that it perhaps does not.
No. But as you do know, we have 26 bishops from the Church of England in the House of Lords who can vote like any other member of the House of Lords on legislation and who can cast their influence on that august upper house of ours. And
you speak like this is a bad thing. Maybe these moral kind of arbiters are useful. How we're going to come on to politics, but
and then you look at how they voted on things like gay marriage, and how they tried to exert their power to slow, nay, stop it happening. Same-sex marriage. People think, there are benign institutions. I admit I have mixed feelings about this, but people say there's some benign institution, and the Church of England is all fine and there's nothing really sort of bad about it and it's all sort of very watered down. But that's not entirely the case. Across the Church of England, you go from very high, very conservative church down to, I think I read once that something like 1 in 5 Church of England vicars say that they're agnostic. I don't know if that statistic is quite right.
That sounds very like the Church of England.
But you do have that sort of range, don't you, from the very high Church of England down to the sort of semi-agnostic.
Well, that mixed feelings, that very famous report, Faith in the City, which was, I think, one of the focal points to political opposition to Maggie Thatcher, which when she was in her kind of, no such thing as society mode, Faith in the City was a very, very well-researched and pretty trenchant report on what happens, the effects of poverty on inner city populations. And when the Toxters Riot happens in 81, I think it was cited as an example of really kind of good trenchant political and cultural analysis.
Which is true, except that the Church of England has a property portfolio of about £2 billion. And if they really wanted to alleviate, the suffering of the poor,
put their money where their
mitres
are.
You might think that they might read the good book and sort of, and read the bit about Eyes of Needle and, and all of that stuff. But hey, who actually reads the Bible? I mean, that was my, as a very religious teenager, that was my moment of realisation in childhood when I suddenly realised that for nearly 20 years of my life, I'd been reading the 4 different Gospels and that they'd been neatly interchanged to suit the narrative of whatever priest was in charge. All very interesting. Another personal note is that both of my kids, because we were in the inner city, I had that eternal problem that you have of sending your children to something called a school.
Yeah.
And when my son was, however old he was, 4 or 5, I started casting around for a local school to send, we started casting around for a local school to send our child to, and the nearest one was a Church of England school, geographically. So I put down, because the local guidance said, apply to your nearest school, I put down that school and all the other schools in order. And then discovered, quite to my horror, actually, the degree to which primary education in London in particular is run by the Church of England, and more to the point, it's selective. So they can select you on faith. Now, if you're 4 years old, you're not really going to have a fully developed faith. So really, the prejudice is against the parents based on their faith. So you had this ridiculous situation where lots of people locally, to me, started pretending to go to church in order to get their children into a Church of England school. Now, I'm very proud to say that I didn't do that. and in fact, my children did get into the local Church of England school and they had a very good education. I think they would have had a very good education regardless of whether it was Church of England. But I was absolutely shocked as to how we were in this situation that the church was running so many of our schools. And then I thought, how is this actually legal? How is the state essentially able to discriminate against people on the basis of the parents' belief structure? And Tony Blair had basically opted us out of that bit in the European Convention on Human Rights in order to make sure that the school system didn't collapse.
Well, I had... Funnily enough, my daughter got interviewed for a Church of England school, which she didn't get into.
Yeah.
And one of the reasons she failed was asked by the headmistress of the school who the Archbishop of Canterbury was ultimately answerable to. She answered, I think rather brilliantly, God.
Yes.
Which was not the right answer, as it turned out. So,
well, who is the answerable? Well, I suppose he's answerable to the king.
Yes, I think there you go. It does feel, doesn't it, anomalous.
I don't think the Church.
I think I feel the Church of England would do a better job if it didn't have this strange kind of semi-political kind of status.
And yes, if they started maybe spending some of that £2 billion that they've got stored up on...
There was a huge scandal where the church commissioners had completely invested it incompetently and lost
and some in arms companies at some point.
Yeah.
I know that. I mean, I'm not a sort of Dawkins-esque, anti-religious sort of, atheist. But I don't believe in God, and I would describe myself as a strong agnostic. But I think faith does have its place for a lot of people. Of all faiths.
Faith and ritual,
and you can't go around shouting at people, oh, why do you believe in God? You're stupid and all that kind of thing. I think it's very, very unhelpful and insulting to people.
Well, it tends to be a paper tiger. The kind of God that Dawkins is always telling us that we shouldn't believe in, I don't think anyone really would believe in. Kind of omnipotent, omniscient, kind of vaguely male kind of creator of the universe. No, that's good.
Like Richard Dawkins.
No, indeed. Well, my dad died last year, and he was a priest, but he'd stopped going to church. He'd actually had a fantastically unpleasant experience with the John Sentamu, who was then the Archbishop of York, who had objected strongly to the way my father was. I think that it was to do with a parish church in York, where my father had been acting as the incumbent, supporting an incumbent, and then somebody had been appointed, and there was a battle in the classic Church of England way where, the church wardens backed the church hierarchy, and it got quite ugly. My dad was always up for a scrap, and he got a massive scrap with Sentamu, and I think that for him, he just decided that the institutional kind of Church of England was no longer a place that he felt he wanted or needed to either practice what faith he had or not. And towards the end of his life, I used to ask him, what do you feel? And he said, I don't need to go to church. He said, if whatever my faith is, and I'm not sure what it is, but I don't need. I said, not even the music? He said, not really. I said, I don't need the music. I don't particularly need the ritual. But he didn't say to me towards the end, let's be honest, he was suffering from dementia towards the end. But he did say to me, I'd given him the book Cuddy by Benjamin Myers, which is about St. Cuthbert. And I rang him. He said, he said, I finished it. He said, I love that book. He said, I could have been that. I said, what, a hermit? What, living on raw onions and having your feet warmed by the breath of otters? Yes, yeah, no, he said, that's my kind of Christianity. So, I don't know, I sort of feel towards the end he'd perhaps made peace with whatever notion of faith for him worked, which was maybe, the northeastern coast and the immensity of the ocean and, all of that, not being told what to do by a very, very arrogant and officious senior member of the Church of England. I think there's quite a lot of that in the Church of England, as people actually just get fed up with the bureaucracy and the obsession with form over content.
Which brings us back to the original topic. Is this a Christian country? And who proclaims this loudest and most often? Well, the usual suspects, Nigel Farage and co. And I often wonder, when Nigel Farage last darkened the door of an actual church and how regularly he goes, because it's code really, isn't it? What you're talking about is a sort of spiritual Christianity. What Farage and co talk about is a sort of identity. And what the Church of England represents is this sort of rather boring behemoth of,
Tory party at prayer.
Tory party at prayer, yeah. In my part of London, the only visible large groups of people who go to church are the local Caribbean community, well, people of Caribbean descent, and people largely in my area of African descent. And my elderly neighbour, Joan, who died about 3 or 4 years ago, who had lived within the 3 or 4 streets of my house for about 80 plus years, she witnessed the church go from being an entirely sort of white working class and middle class thing in our local area into being predominantly of people of Caribbean extraction. And so, yes, those people do seem to keep the church going.
It's absolutely the case. There's probably a better argument for saying that America is more of a Christian country than England, UK.
Absolutely. I think they've got more varieties of Christianity than shop chains. Something like 3,000 denominations, I think, in the United States, yeah.
So, Britain is Christian? Science or superstition, miracle or myth, hogwash or holy water? Well, though my mind is supposed to be pretty binary, AI tells me, quote, Britain, or the United Kingdom, brackets UK, as a whole, is a complex case when it comes to its religious identity. It's historically Christian, but legally not, and has a declining Christian identity. So, there's no simple yes or no answer.
Well, that could be from the Synod of the Church of England, couldn't it? The General Synod, it's so mimsy as to be of no use whatsoever. Yeah. Also, factually inaccurate, Otto.
Yeah,
no,
it
is legally.
Yes, it's
the state religion, Church of
England, not in Scotland, but in England, it is. Yes, it's the state faith. It's the established faith. So that's a load of twaddle, I'm afraid. I also feel we've missed one important ingredient here, and that's the other faiths in this country.
Yes.
And I believe that practitioners of Islam far outnumber the practitioners of Christianity. So if you're doing it as a numbers game, you could argue that Britain is more Muslim than practicing Christian, but I don't.
But you're not going to do that.
I'm not going to do that
for
reasons
safety.
Of personal safety, yes.
And the conclusion is piffle. This week, Otto's starter for 10 for John is about our Parliament and whether standards have declined in the era of Owen Paterson, Boris Johnson, or Matt Hancock. Who is Britain's worst ever Member of Parliament?
I'm fascinated by this, John. I'm sure that you're going to put in a sort of brave defence of our parliamentarians, but please, go for it.
Let's be honest, the bar is set fairly low, but I think I have uncovered the most ridiculously bad MP that this country has ever had. And there have been some wrong-uns. But Ignác Trebic was born in the late 19th century in Pax in central Hungary, Orthodox Jewish family. He came to Britain, converted to Anglicanism, as it turns out. It was briefly a missionary and then became a curate in a parish in Appledore in Kent. Was spotted by the great liberal Quaker entrepreneur Benjamin Rowntree. Rowntree employs him. By this time, Trebic has changed his name by deed poll to Lincoln, so he's Ignác Trebic Lincoln. Becomes research assistant for Rowntree. Rowntree likes him so much, he puts him forward as the Liberal candidate in the 1910 general election in Darlington, which was then a safe Conservative seat. He's endorsed by Lord George and he's endorsed by Churchill, who was, of course, at that stage still a Liberal. And he wins by 29 votes. He becomes MP for Darlington in 1910 and then discovers that actually it's terrible being an MP. In those days, they didn't really get expenses. So he gets into terrible debt. And then resigns as an MP. This is his brief moment of being an MP. Resigns and says, I can't do this, I can't afford to do this. And then turns his creative attentions to being a stock market fraudster. He is about to be arrested when he disappears to America. Now, you can see the timeline here. We're getting towards the war, or in fact, we're in the war. He decides that to save his skin, he's going to work for the German government. So he becomes a German spy. Now, he's in America, he gets arrested, he goes on trial. He announces that he sells his story about how I was a German spy and sold all these British secrets. He escapes, gets arrested again, escapes, and then ends up in Germany, where he falls in with, remember he was brought up as a Jew in Hungary, he falls in with a young group of right-wing revolutionaries.
We can see where this is going.
And he joins the 1920 putsch. And he is made by Hitler Minister of Information briefly in that brief government. Of course, the putsch doesn't happen. So what would you do then? He decides he's going to chance his arm in the Far East. He goes to the Far East, becomes, I'm sorry, I shouldn't laugh because it isn't all that funny, really. He reinvents himself, converts to Buddhism, becomes a bodhisattva, and he's the first Western person to set up a Buddhist monastery. And then finally, with he offers his services once again to the Nazis and the Japanese, to be a spy. And also he said he can deliver the East. I will deliver the East to you instead of the Allies during the Second World War. And finally, he was at that stage known as Chao Kung. I think the Nazis decide that they've had enough of him, and he's poisoned on explicit Nazi sort of orders.
Extraordinary story.
So, he kind of makes Boris Johnson look a little like Gandhi.
Well, but
frankly.
there are people a bit like that in our modern parliament. I'm not going to say any because I don't really want to get sued, but there are several people I can imagine following that kind
It's that total thing about being slightly, I don't know whether you call it sociopathic or even psychopathic, that inability to stop lying and just to completely reinvent yourself. No obvious political faith at all, other than just, I have to keep going and I have to reinvent myself in a way that will keep my reputation going. You sort of feel, although it's a cute sort of story from the Parliament's deep past, it has a horrible kind of modern resonance, don't you think?
Yeah. Am I right in thinking that 1910 was the first election where members of Parliament were paid?
Yes, and I think that was the shock to him. He didn't realise how low the pay was going to be.
But it was the first. So up until that point, MPs were hobbyists, posh, rich hobbyists, basically. And at that point, they brought in was it 1910? Yes, I'm pretty sure it was 1910,
And he remains the only British MP to have ever served as a minister in a German government, albeit a very short-lived German government. But it's just an insane story.
Yes.
I mean, how did Hitler and his kind of thugs not even... I think they did start to look into Trebuchet's past, Lincoln's past, and recognise that he was a very odd fellow traveller.
You have Maud Ramsay in the 1940s, who is found to basically be spying on behalf of the Nazis and ends up in prison for the duration of the war as an agent of the enemy. And Archibald Maud Ramsay, he was called.
Amazing.
He came from an extremely posh background. I think he was an old Etonian or an old Harrovian. And he continued to ask written questions from either Wandsworth Prison or wherever he was held without a sort of care in the world for the fact that he was on the wrong side. It was Archibald Maud Ramsay who was partly responsible for Kennedy getting kicked out as the ambassador to London in 1941 or whatever that was. It was a big spy scandal at the time, but it was all hushed up because they were all chums with each other, of course. Yeah. They all knew each other socially, just as Churchill was friends with Coco Chanel, and that was all covered up at the end of the Second World War. I was reading recently about the Gordon riots.
Ah, yes.
And Lord Gordon, who, of course, was an MP in a rotten borough in the 18th century and early 19th century, who caused the Gordon riots, which was this chaotic week of anarchy in London.
Written about in Barnaby Rudge by Dickens as well. It's amazing.
So nutty. I mean, they set out trying to burn down any Catholic building they could find, all sort of pushed on by this extremely vain, self-serving member of Parliament who had a great mop of blonde hair. I mean, you wouldn't find anyone in Parliament like that nowadays, I'm sure, just sort of out for themselves and willing to latch on to any terrible sort of xenophobic cause in order to further their own career. But if any listeners have heard of someone like that, maybe they could write in with some hints.
Indeed. And I just think that idea of being a wrong and not preventing you from rising to the highest office in the land, that's... I don't know, that I genuinely think most MPs actually do quite a good job. They work hard, and I think, they hold their surgeries. Not Nadine Dorries, obviously, but there are
who thankfully is no longer a member of Parliament.
Indeed, yeah.
Unfortunately, the job attracts a certain type of person. Not all of them are like that, but there's a certain proportion throughout history of sort of... I mean, the last, before we move on, but the last who wasn't actually an MP, but he was a hereditary peer, the extraordinary Lord Moynihan, who I think died in a brothel in Bangkok, having asked a series of insane questions in the House of Lords over 20 years. Yeah.
When I was a student, the last two places you would have gone to hang out were any of the political clubs,
yes,
or any of the religious kind of organisations. It's just...
And we've covered it all
And
today. Here we go.
Here we go, yeah.
So now we need to ask AI Joe.
Yeah.
It sounds like an action figure. AI Joe,
Or an inaction
what's
figure.
the story?
There we have it. Who is Britain's worst ever MP? My vast neural network, which burns millions of kilojoules of energy just to answer your question, has decided this. I'm still learning how to answer this question. In the meantime, try Google search.
That
A
is
rare
marvellous.
moment of honesty from the artificial intelligence
I will
world.
raise
yeah.
a glass to the absolutely
Yes.
to the honesty and integrity of AI Joe in this instance.
Yes. I don't think we can score this one, John. I think it sort of goes beyond our capabilities.
Well, it's certainly beyond the capabilities of AI Joe, and
Yes.
frankly, if it's beyond the capabilities of AI Joe, I think we can plead the fifth on this one.
I think we do.
At the midway point of this first series, who is leading the battle for utter bollocks? Has John the bigger bucket full of cojones? Or is Otto playing pocket billiards with a winner? Who's up? Who's down? Can the human brain beat the machine? Or does the algorithm always win? Stay tuned for our overall score at the end of the series. And now we come to our quick-fire round with questions submitted by you, our fearless and intrepid listeners. Katie from Ealing asks, are we drinking Shakespeare's urine?
Only if you're in the wrong pub.
I actually sort of do know the answer to this question. It was a QI question back in the day. And I can remember two really good things. One is it's about a quadrillionth of us, each of us, is potentially made up of Shakespeare's atoms. And that 1 in 7 of them were atoms that probably came from his effluvia. That's
So in sort of idiots.
so quadrillionth
idiots
is
numbers.
10 to the 15th. So 1 over 10 to the 15th. So a tiny amount of us.
Like
I don't know, 5 billion atoms, of which is not
not
terrible.
even a dandruff full.
I think over the lifetime, it was something like 5 billion of Shakespeare's atoms would probably pass through each of us. Everybody, obviously. A few more people in Britain would have a slightly higher proportion. But also it's the case that a very large cow would have more Shakespeare in them than, your average human, because it's just how matter gets recycled. So yes is the answer. We all do have a little bit of Shakespeare.
A little bit of William in us.
A little bit of William in us.
Funnily enough, John, talking of Shakespeare.
Yes, I know what you're going to say.
We will be covering that subject next week.
Indeed we will. The 23rd of April is Shakespeare's birthday, and I think that's when we're due to be recording.
I'm looking forward to it.
Me too.
Thank you for putting on your hazmat suits and wading through this stuff with us. If you have any questions you want answered by Otto or John, do go to the Utter Bollocks website or visit bylineaudio.com or find us on X, Twitter.
So I think we've covered it all there, John, from otter's breath to parliamentary privilege to God to banged up MPs in league with the Nazis.
Anti-disestablishmentarianism.
And just enough time to slip in flocky knocky nihilopilification, although I think I've mispronounced it. It's actually flotchy notchy nihilopilification, but never mind.
Well, there you go.
Anyway, I think we've covered it all. So, it's goodbye from me, Otto English.
And it's goodbye from me, John Mitchinson.
This has been a Byline audio production in association with Unbound, produced and edited by Marcus de Cruz and Ed Hartwell, with Otto English and John Mitchinson, and narrated by me, Joanna Scanlon. Find us wherever you get your podcasts, and do subscribe on bylineaudio.com.